Welcome to Time for the Soul, the podcast where we talk about life, the universe, and our Lord Jesus Christ. And today we have with us myself and Rafi.
Hello.
And Liana.
Hey guys.
Today our guest is Mike Gnatyuk, a fellow brother in Christ and a friend from the Slavic Pentecostal community. We met him in 2020 at some of the gatherings during the pandemic. We're so grateful that our paths crossed and that we get to sit here today and talk about the amazing experiences he's had on the mission field in the Ukraine and the way that God's used him to bring hope and to experience life in the context of war. Mike, welcome.
Thanks for having me, guys. I'm glad to be a part of this episode.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, more in detail, your background, your family, community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm from the Slavic Pentecostal community. So that basically means that any part that's part of the Slavic country, so like that's, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Polish as well, but I guess in our context we'll be just mainly talking about Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. So my background is I'm part of that community. I go to a Russian-speaking church, but we have a lot of people from different parts of the former Soviet Union republic. So we have a pretty small church, at least the church here in Chicago. We have people from, Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Moldovan. We have Romanian as well. So honestly, it's a lot of different people, but we're all kind of united because of the Soviet Union and how everyone was forced to speak Russian, or united in speaking the common language. But everybody has their own sort of background, where they come from, and traditions from that as well.
Does it make it hard to mesh everybody together?
Honestly, no, because the thing is, the Soviet Union has been around it was around for like 70, 80 years. So the mentality and the way that they were taught in schools, it was almost like normalized. So people were growing up in their own countries and speaking their own languages, like in Ukraine. Everybody, up until the Soviet Union fell, everybody, most people were speaking Russian and Ukrainian. In schools, they were teaching Russian, but they spoke Ukrainian at home. Wow, and the same thing with different countries as well. So, 80 years, that's almost 4 generations. Mm-hmm. Wow. So it's kind of ingrained into people's minds. So most people have that commonality, even like in my work or in my previous job when I met someone who was from like Tajikistan or something like that, which is even more like in Asia, they have a little bit different facial features as well, kind of a little bit more Asian looking, but they speak Russian, and it's just good to be able to connect with them, So obviously what the Soviet Union did for 80 years, was a lot of crimes and tragedies that's happened, but it's kind of connected people from different backgrounds. So
because you guys have a shared history now, and you have a shared language, so that the biggest barriers usually tend to be language. So now that that's gone, and you have all that shared trauma, it's great, that culture. Yes. I can see how then a church with that shared history, shared culture would be able to work pretty well, even if you are a bunch of different ethnicities coming together. That's pretty awesome.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's my background. So I'm technically Ukrainian. I was born in the U.S., but both my parents are Ukrainian. My mom is from Kiev, the capital, and my dad is from Chernovtsi or Cernăuți in Romanian, which is a border city of Romania. It used to be part of Romania until 1950, 1955, which was called Bukovina at that time. So the two main cities of Bukovina was Suceava and Cernăuți, but the leaders during that time decided to split it up. So the northern half would be part of Ukraine, the southern half would be part of or stay with Romania. But most of the people in Chernovtsi or Cernăuți, they are ethnically Romanian, but they have the Slavic Ukrainian side. So they're an interesting mix of people. So that's my dad, where he comes from. His first language was Romanian, actually.
That's so
cool.
He
didn't learn Russian until he went into the army, to the service. But my mom speaks Russian and Ukrainian. That's their shared language, and that's what they taught their children, us.
So you speak Romanian and Russian, or just mainly Russian and a little bit of Romanian?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Russian, mainly Romanian. I can understand Ukrainian as well for the most part. Speaking not as much, just because I don't have that practice. Because at home we speak Russian. My church is in Russian, but we have Ukrainians here in Chicago. I hang out with them and can understand it. But yeah, I don't have as much practice.
So since we're on the Ukrainian Slavic topic, what are some of the best characteristics of the Slavic people and some of the worst, quote unquote?
So I'll give you one answer to answer both those questions. So the thing is, it's very interesting. The Slavic people, they're maybe it's something similar with Romanians, which I've seen, but with Ukrainians, they're very stubborn. So that is both a plus and a minus, because I've seen a lot of the stories of my parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. And as you know, there's a testimony that my great-grandfather wrote talking about his life. And I see how hardcore and how devoted they were to their convictions and beliefs and not being able to be swayed left or right. And that obviously has to come that comes from living in the Soviet Union as well, because in that time you were always living in a state of survival. Wow. Yeah. It was almost, you had to be very, very defensive, because there were even people, they would go to the underground church. There are people you couldn't even trust because they would rat you out to the KGB. And then next week, I can understand why they're so devoted or stubborn, quote unquote. There's one situation they were having like a service in an underground church. It was a gathering of like 15, 20 people or something. And the KGB found out about it. They came there and usually they would arrest people, but they ended up killing everyone at this meeting. Wow. They take stories like that, and that's why their hymn book is so revered, is because, there were people that were died, that were killed while holding it, it's, with spilling their own blood over it. So that's something that's an incredible plus, or you could say a pro, but also it's a con because it kind of flows into the other part of their social lives, right? So just social interaction. Us growing up in America or North America, we're kind of accustomed to the American or the Canadian way, style, which is different than Eastern Europe or how the Soviet Union, and it's matching that too. Like you can see like the way that they act. It's like, okay, you don't have to be that extreme, because we grew up here and we understand like a certain way. Like we've never had to, persecuted or people trying to kill us or, state of survival. So I would say that's both a plus and a minus.
That's a great answer.
So,
So do you think that history has carried over to the church in 2022 as it is today, the Slavic church?
Absolutely, yeah. I definitely think it's a generational thing, because there are people that are my age, have been born and raised in the U.S., but they're very similar in their nature and personality. Yeah. So it's something something that's definitely passed on. And there are churches that I would say that are more traditional and hold even more to those values than, for example, where I live or my church. But yeah, it definitely does flow into modern 2022.
I guess one question I would have, does that history of trauma and that history of that Soviet fear that they lived under, do you think that has led the Slavic church to be within its own members more trusting? Or do you think that kind of breeds distrust in the members? Like how can a church be united, even now in this day and age, having that in its history?
Yeah, that's a good question, because there obviously isn't that persecution anymore, but their nature and their personality and how they act is still like that, Like I said before, there's definitely pluses and pros to that, but it's such an interesting time, especially for the younger people, because we're like hybrids, right? Like okay, like we eat sarmale and borscht, but
no borscht.
well, to get both, communities, sarmale and chorba, and then I would eat borscht and pilmeni or something like that, but we literally speak English, Americans or North Americans,
or we'll go and have some tacos and some pizzas,
exactly,
and enjoy it just as much as we do.
And then I have friends here. They're like, oh, here's the Ukrainian or Russian guy. Like when I went to Ukraine, here's the American guy. It's like, even though they know I speak the language, but I was born and raised here, so it's such an interesting and unique position that a lot of us carry. So it's definitely been a question that's a little bit harder to answer because it's not been so straightforward. It's a little bit hard to navigate through those waters. It's like, okay, like how do we navigate through the contemporary or our local environment versus balancing out where our parents and what they teach us? And so I definitely think we have to do a balance. We have to kind of navigate, take the good and then leave the bad.
Yeah.
You know, I've heard this line before. I don't remember, but somebody once said in terms of this whole cultural thing, yesterday's miracles has become today's legalism.
Oh, that's a good one.
You know, because a lot of the things that our parents and grandparents experience, you know, the visions and the dreams and the prophecies and everything literally, you know, being shot at, you know, by Nazis or the KGB. I don't doubt at all that they experienced the presence of God, that it was real. But obviously our environment right here, you know, in North America, it's completely different. And it's not that God changes. The way that we experience God, maybe it looks a little bit different, but they want to hold on to that. And I totally understand them as well because that's how they experience God. Yeah. And like I said, I mean, I would have maybe want to experience that as well. Not the hardships per se, but like the way that they just felt the anointing of God. But it's different, you know. In North America, we don't have to experience that. So it's like, so how do we go about experiencing the gifts and the anointing of God? I think that's what's the biggest question. It's a little bit of a dividing factor between the older and younger generation.
Do you think, since we're in a weird time right now, and this is 2022, pandemic, wars, which we're going to get to the part of your mission in the Ukraine, do you think if hard times come, we're going to experience those things again? Or it's going to push us to experience maybe, quote unquote, more miracles of God? Because right now it's like we're still pretty comfortable.
I think it's both. I think it's both because the modern day church, this is just my personal opinion, I don't think we're ready for that. Whereas for them, the older generation, they literally were born and raised in that. So that's all they've ever known. And us, we've lived in such a comfortable, you know, comparatively lifestyle. I think that if it does come, nobody can really say what's going to happen. I definitely think there'll be miraculous miracles, for lack of better words, that will be seen, but there'll definitely be a lot of hardships. And it just depends on your relationship to God, on what side you come out of.
Yeah. I think preparation in the quote-unquote good times will be a good indicator of how you experience the bad. So do you think we're going to be able to experience like the miracles of, I don't know, we're going to see people healed and delivered on the streets, and then from there we're going to see like even greater things as like the times of tribulation come, because who's ready for hard times? I think you get ready for the hard times, yes, before, but even during. I think if the seed is in you before, it's just going to take root and hopefully flourish, the good seed.
I definitely think so, because if you pay attention to anything that's happening in our society, all this, you could just say filth and everything that's happening in our culture, it's not that this is something new, because in ancient times they had all these types of sins too, but it's on a level that hasn't been experienced, at least in our modern day society. So if we really believe that we are at least living close to, if not in the last days, I mean, it says your sons and daughters will see visions and prophesy. Obviously, there's going to be such an outpouring of the Holy Spirit, and the gifts that people will be experiencing are those who are close to God. I think that's the reality. Absolutely.
I would kind of push back on this point, though, in the sense that I think people who are even now living the gospel call are seeing those healings. They are seeing those miracles. They are seeing that power. So even though we might be living in comfortable times, so to speak, those that are actually living out the gospel call are still seeing that. It's just maybe we're not seeing it that frequently because it's not everybody doing it. But those that are faithful, I think, see the fruit of those prayers. I don't think we just have to wait for hard times to come in order to see miracles happen. They do happen when hard times come. Absolutely. There is a grace over that. But I do think even in the comfortable times, if we're living in the will and the calling of God, we will see those things.
Yeah, Yeah, no, I absolutely. That's a good point to clear it up. But yeah, it's definitely true.
Yeah. So going to your time that you spent in Ukraine recently, can you tell us a little bit more about the ministry that you worked with and what you guys did there, what your experiences were there on the ground?
Yeah, so I worked with a couple of different ministries, actually. The official ministry organization that I was a part of was called Solid Rock Mission. They are a Slavic Christian organization that's based in Seattle, Washington. So they have teams in Romania, in Poland, in Ukraine. They do missionary groups as well. The leader, his name's Slavic Gnatyuk. He is a former student of Slavic Missionary Bible School, SMBS, in Jacksonville. And after he graduated from that Bible school, he kind of started this whole mission organization. And it's been pretty fruitful. But I was officially a member of that organization and sponsored to go to Ukraine and Romania. There was a group of 6 of us. It was 5 girls and myself.
Wow, wait, hold up. Time out. How many women?
5.
Hallelujah. Look at those women going out. Men, step up.
Mike, you should have recruited the men.
You know what?
Right?
It's not as nice as you think it is. No, I mean they were a good group. They were a good team.
Hallelujah.
Maybe it would have been nice if maybe just one other guy.
Yes.
But I just
you were outnumbered to
being the black sheep. So.
Did they make you carry all the heavy things?
Possibly. Yeah. And maybe take some pictures too. But yeah,
Alright, sorry. Please continue.
That's fine. No, but we had a good team. So we flew into Romania, actually, Bucharest. Then we took a train to Suceava. Our base was in Suceava. Now, we worked at a refugee center for another organization that was called Fight for Freedom. Their leader is Gheorghe Ignat, or Ghiță Ignat. And we did a lot of work with him when we were in Romania. Now, we went in and out of Ukraine because we didn't have a base. Obviously, it's a war-torn country right now, so there's some uncertainties. So we didn't actually sleep or stay in Ukraine, but I was there twice. The first time I was there for a couple days, came back to Romania for a few days to work at the refugee center, then went back to Ukraine for about a week. And that's the main mission where I worked with GCS, which is Great Commission Society, and their leader is Tony Anthony. Tony Anthony is an evangelist from the UK, England. He lives in London, but he travels. He's a full-time missionary. He travels pretty much every single week. After we finished our mission in Ukraine, I think he flew to India to the embassy to do something, and then he flew to another country. This was in May, about middle of May, and then this past week he went back to Ukraine. So his organization has team members in 110 different countries. Now there could be 1 or 2 team members, but there's people in a lot of different countries, and that's his main goal of spreading the gospel. Even when we were giving humanitarian aid, his main thing was always when there were troubles about where to transport, he's okay, but when can we share the gospel? When can we preach? When can we tell people this is really why we're doing this. So those are the organizations that I worked with.
So while you were there, obviously you saw many things, both on the ground, you saw how missions operate, you saw maybe you had some insight into how government leadership work in time of war, and you got to interact with a lot of people. What were some of the greatest fruits that you saw in the ministry there? Yeah.
So there were a few couple ones, actually. One is the way that people were united for a common cause. We were in contact, and there was a lot of moving parts in order to get all this stuff done. So the main process, you could say, we crossed the border, we went to Chernobyl to buy all the food. We bought it locally, which is good for the economy as well. They bought, the mission that I was on for that week, they bought about 40 tons of food, and that's European tons. So that's maybe 10 tons in North America or something like that. It's still a lot of food. We were transporting it into the buses, the coach buses, these large Sprinter vans, microbuses, they call them. But we went to a large grocery store. They call it Metro, which is kind of like a Costco or Sam's Club. Bought all this food, brought it, drove it 2 hours to the northeast to another city. And from there, they packaged it, distributed it into different buses, different vehicles in order to bring it to like 7 different cities. So in order to get all these moving parts, there had to be a lot of conversations, people willing and wanting to help. And obviously that puts a lot of responsibility on the local population, because I was considered a foreigner because, I don't live there, so I don't know the local people, and so is, Tony Anthony. So he needed to depend on a lot of local people, trustworthy people, for them to reach out to also trustworthy people, because they've actually been having, not them personally, but in Ukraine, there's situations where people would say they're driving humanitarian aid to another city, but in fact they'll actually steal it. They won't deliver it to the city. They'll bring it to like a flea market or something and sell it for like 70% of what it's cost. Obviously, people are going to buy it right away, and they just pocket the money.
Oh, man.
Now, it's kind of sad to see, because a lot of those people they're locals, they're Ukrainians that are doing this. And it's like, well, you have to help your own people. It's like, obviously, everyone's trying to survive, and, here you're just being selfish. But being united over a common cause, and obviously a lot of these people were Christians, believers, so it's good to see that. But fruits as well as on the other side of people, non-Christians that were receptive, or I guess wanting to hear what the gospel is all about. So one of the cities that we went to is called Chernigov or Chernihiv. It's different pronunciation based on the Russian and Ukrainian. We went to that city. It's about an hour and a half away from the Belarusian border, so very close to Belarus. That's where the Russian troops were actually there on foot on the outskirts of the city. It's also one of the cities that was bombarded a lot with missiles, rockets. And I got to see a lot of the damage, a lot of the buildings that were destroyed, hospitals, pharmacies. There was one point, I told you guys before, but in a certain part, there were like 40 people that died. And just like walking through that rubble, through the buildings, and just, imagining yourself that like, a month prior to this or 2 months prior to exactly where you're standing, there were people literally dying, just waiting to get their medicine, and all of a sudden, rockets out of nowhere, and that's it. Their life is gone. So that was a very surreal moment for me. But when we were in that city, we brought some of the aid, some of the food, and Tony said, well, before we give it out, obviously we have to preach the gospel. So he gave a 10-15 minute short sermon, which I translated for him. It was interesting because I was able to see the people, and even when we were giving out the food and the humanitarian aid, how receptive people were.
Wow.
After we preached and gave out the food, obviously we stayed there for like an hour or 2 hours and just talking to people, right? So I was translating with him. He was having personal conversations as well. And just how needy people were, not only for the food, but you could just see it in their demeanor and their faces, like obviously this war had a huge impact on them. Yeah. They weren't expecting it. They obviously didn't ask for it.
Yeah.
So it's changed them a little bit. And there was one lady in particular. She said that she was raised in the church. She's heard about, I believe it was Orthodox Church, so not born again, but she knows kind of the standards of Christianity and all that. And Tony was speaking to her, and she had the softest personality. She was, the softest person. She was tears in her eyes the entire time. She's like, this stuff that you speak, about God and Jesus. She's like, it's like, I understand that, like I hear what you're saying, but she's like, it's just hasn't had a personal connection with me here in my heart. And she understands this too. And, she's being authentic as well, because she obviously wants to know what the peace of God is, right? Yeah. What it means to be truly set free from this life, from the fleshly nature of life. But she's like, it's just hard for me to accept that because of what's happening. Oh. So we testified to her, we spoke to her, and she kind of told us her story. We left just encouraging her. I pray God would change her heart, and one day she would come to Christ. Maybe there's a time she will where I wouldn't be there, obviously. But yeah, that was just one conversation of many that we had while we were there. So
what were some of the common themes people were talking about? The surprise of it all, probably was one of them. But what else did they keep mentioning? Is there a theme that they kept going back to?
Yeah, there's one common theme, and a lot of people were asking why. They were asking why was all this happening to them, and you can't really. Obviously, we're not God. So even as Christians, we know that when we ask why, that's not really a good thing either, because we know that God's plan is God is sovereign. He has everything in his hands. He's divine and knows the plans for us, even though we may not see in the present what he's doing. So for us, it's kind of hard to give an answer to those people. We obviously do tell them about, God's plan. He has everything in control, and there is a reason for everything. And we tell them, their suffering is not meaningless. There is a reason to it. In fact, it should bring them closer to Christ, because they'll see that this world, if there was no God, if there was no nothing, then their suffering would be meaningless, because there would be no meaning to it. There are people dying. What's the point of it in the end, Yeah. But because there is a God. And so we try to help people understand it. We try to explain that to them. But it is hard sometimes to get that breakthrough in people, because they've personally felt, some of them, their family members, parents, brothers died, and even if they didn't die, some of them went to the war fight and they die on the front, So that's kind of the common theme. And it's a little bit unique. Even Tony was telling me that for him, this is not a typical way that he does evangelism, because a lot of the countries he goes to, Africa and other stuff, they have suffering as well, but war is a different type of suffering, and you need to respond to it a little bit differently. And that wasn't typical for him. He's like, I don't go to war-torn countries. I go to different countries where the gospel needs to be shared. People need to hear it. But when people are in war, it's a little bit different.
I think one of the interesting things that war and suffering, especially what's happening in Ukraine, brings to mind is the theology of the justice of Christ. So, and it's something that we don't really pay attention to, but I'm just, even as you were speaking, I was just reminded of all the Psalms that remind us God is just, God is righteous. There will be mercy for those, against those who are afflicted, against those who injustice is put upon. Christ is their justice. And I know for some people it might not seem like a great comfort, but for me it's a great comfort knowing that despite all the injustice that's happening in the world, one day at the end, we know that Christ will bring that final justice, that final retribution, even that final revenge. And I know that kind of sounds like a harsh word, but this is something that I think when people are suffering needlessly, we have to realize it has meaning. It has meaning. And just the fact that God will bring that justice at the end of days, man, that just means a lot. I'm sitting here in a comfortable place. We're here recording in Chicago. It's beautiful outside. It's hard kind of to envision it, but even that is bringing me comfort. How much more to a person who actually has faced that injustice and that unrighteousness against them.
How did you see the response of the church to what was happening in the Ukraine? Maybe the local churches. How did the war impact them as a body of Christ, on a local level?
So I'll say some of the people they've become more, assertive or actionary. That's probably not a word, but there are some churches that are very for getting things done, and I put that in air quotes, in any means possible. I understand where they're coming from because they want to defend their country, but that could mean supporting the military side of things, which that could be a little bit room for controversy because obviously Christians have their own opinions on guns or whatever, but I did have a little bit of discussion talking to the locals while we were driving, and another missionary with me, on the whole question of, so how do we do this with arms and weapons? Do we support it? Do we not? my personal conviction is obviously the gospel is the only thing that can change a person's heart. Doesn't matter who you are. Could be a general in the army. Could be, a lukewarm Christian. The gospel and the hope of Christ in your heart, the peace of God and the love is the only thing that can change a person's heart. So I believe that wholeheartedly. When somebody, comes and attacks your home, breaks into you, it's kind of hard because, I've never had to experience that. So I don't know what I would do. And, they're like, well, we have to defend our country. What are we supposed to do? So that's been a little bit of, some churches have been like that. But I'll say a lot of churches have gone, I'll put it this way, opposite to the contemporary Western church. And what I mean by that is if you look at the contemporary, American, North American, Western style of church, obviously I'm not sure all churches, this is not majority, but the way that the culture is moving, it's all very feel-good, seeker-sensitive. And the thing is, the style of that church just does not work in that. It doesn't work in that situation. Yeah. And what I see is, okay, if it doesn't work in that situation, then is that the style that it should be? In general, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. So I see a lot of those churches as well kind of leaving a lot of the things, superficial things that maybe they're experiencing just like full-fledged, just depending on God. Prayer meetings, they're depending on God. Fellowship with each other, kind of, like, hey, this is a real situation we're living in. Like, there's no time for spiritual fluff. No time for, all this other stuff. Because this is a matter of life and death. Like, physically life and death. So it kind of gets to the root or the heart of what the church should be. So
would you say the spiritual atmosphere in the church has been, I don't even know how to say this, like revived? Like, do you feel like there is a certain revival stirring up in those churches? Or does it depend on the area that was impacted?
Yeah, I think it probably does depend on the area impact. Obviously, the eastern and the southern parts, maybe a little bit more, but also the western central parts. Whether you want to call it like a full revival, I'm not sure. I didn't visit all of Ukraine, so I don't know. But there's definitely been a stirring in people's hearts, and basically they come into a realization that, hey, this is something that's real, and we need to stop playing games. But that's in the church. On the flip side, and I'll go a little bit on a tangent here. When I was in Kiev, which is the capital, the troops were on the outskirts of the city at the height of the war. Since then, now all the troops have gone to the eastern parts, so the Donbass region, Donetsk, Lugansk, and Crimea, and just north of Crimea. So it's been back to the original front lines of when the war first started in 2013. Because this war has been going on for 8 years. It just hasn't been called a war because the Russian side was saying, well, there's no Russian troops in Ukraine. It's just separatists, so civil war. It's not really a war. But there's been fighting since 2013 for the past 8 years. So a lot of that fighting is on the eastern part. So when I went to Kiev, in the capital, like, honestly, people are acting like there is no war. Like, they're out in the streets. No, they're in malls, they're in shopping markets, they're doing stuff. Honestly, this idea came to me because my dad's cousin, who lives in Bucharest, actually, she guided us a little bit when I landed there. She, we had fellowship. She talked to me, and she was like, yes, like people in Romania, in Bucharest, they have Ukrainian refugees as well, obviously, so travel a lot, but even Bucharest. And she's like, yeah, people are acting like people haven't learned anything. Wow. Even through this war, it's like, it's almost this state of comfort always comes back. And if it comes back with even more. People experience, that first 2 weeks of the war, people dying. It's like, this is terrible, support for Ukraine and all this. Yeah. And then like people get back to say like, well, if it doesn't affect me, I don't really care, Wow. And I fear where that's going to go.
Yeah. Do you think this has to do with, I think I've mentioned this to you when we had this conversation, but do you think it has to do with the way that, and I don't want to like start a huge topic, but the way that we use social media and phones, I feel like certain aspects of our mind have been numbed.
Yes.
We don't process things the same way because they're processed so fast through our phones that our brain can't fully comprehend like what is going on? Like, this is not a movie. This is real life. Yeah. Like, people are dying and you could maybe die tomorrow. Like, I saw something on the news. Literally, the tanks were, like, there and there was attacks. And people were taking selfies with the tanks after people were killed.
Oh, jeez.
So, seeing that on the news and hearing that, to me, I feel like we have become a society of numbness.
Yeah.
Where we're not processing things the right way. And our brain doesn't process things the right way. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know how do you think that plays out?
Yeah, absolutely. Our culture and society today is, like you said, like scrolling through social media. I know that's true because I've kind of felt the experiences of that myself. Not to an extreme maybe, but our society today, the effects of numbness and comfort, people are just so desiring for that. And actually there's a passage that talks about in Luke chapter 9, 57. Basically, somebody asks Jesus, when somebody, they were journeying on the road, and then somebody says to Jesus, "Oh, Lord, I'll follow you wherever you go." And Jesus basically challenges him, and it's like, "Are you sure you want to follow me? Like, what is this life of following me, of being a disciple really means?" And he says, "Foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." And then, they kind of like say like, okay, like what does that mean? And basically, Jesus goes into this parable or gives examples of people saying, "Well, Lord, I'll follow you, but let me go first and bury my father," right? And then another says, "Lord, I'll follow you, but first let me go and bid people at my house, let me say goodbye to them." And I think that right there just explains the whole thing of comfort, like this is not something that we come up with. This is literally, from the Bible that Jesus is talking about. Like, this is a problem that people have struggled with over the ages. So it's nothing new, but if people understand, if you're part of the faith, you put your trust in Jesus, that your life is not going to be comfortable. Yeah. But as the more that we progress towards the last days and all this stuff, the devil is working so hard for people to be in that state of comfort.
Yes.
I think somebody said, I don't even remember. I heard it recently. I think my brother or someone, I don't remember exactly, but honestly, the devil doesn't really have to work. Wow. He doesn't really have to work in people. All he has to do is just lie to them and deceive them. Yeah. And that's it. Humanity, their own nature will destroy themselves, right?
Yeah.
Because they'll always want to go back to that state of comfort. And because of that desire to go to that state of comfort, they become numb to everything else around it.
If we look at 1 Peter 4:12, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange was happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed." In terms of the church and the expectation for good times versus bad times, I think we have an expectation of seeing Christ's glory revealed, but that could be also revealed through suffering. And I think in an American context where we want the abundant life, the way we define the abundant life is through maybe a more materialistic or
just the easy life. I think abundant
the
life
easy
sometimes
life.
we think is the easy life. Yeah.
Path to destruction is wide, right? It's only through the narrow gate. And whenever I think of that, I think about the story of Pilgrim's Progress and, the way that he goes through. And it's, if you just think about it, it's every step of his path, every step, everything from finally getting his burdens, being forgiven, even afterwards, going to the celestial city, like every single step was not comfortable for him. But it just seemed amazing because even through it all, he still had that common goal to get to the, heavenly city. So.
Amen. Going and looking back over the conversation we just had, is there anything that you want to leave us with, the people who are listening? What do you want them to walk away with, having heard this conversation?
I want people to understand, at least from the experience and the testimony that I had, and this is for a lot of the people that are living in this comfortable, quote unquote, we'll call it North American society, right? A lot of the pictures, the stories, right? The testimony that I shared with you, like, why do I share it with people, right? Like, what's the whole point of it? It doesn't do me good. because I've seen it personally. I've seen it firsthand. But if it can stir up some sort of emotion or some sort of desire or plant some sort of seed that starts a process of renewal or revival in somebody's heart here, then that's what the whole main goal of it, right, is, you know. Maybe some of the younger generation or the youth is thinking like, you know, oh, well, that's over there in Ukraine. That's in a war-torn country. I don't really feel effective. I don't really feel, but honestly, spreading the gospel and evangelizing here is so needed, if not, you know, I don't want to say more, but I want people to understand, like, just having that, to know what your testimony is and sharing that is so important, because maybe what you experienced can give the exact encouragement and enlighten someone to come to Christ. God can take a nobody and turn them into a somebody to influence everybody.
Wow.
You know? And if every single one of us acted that way, then, you know, we could turn mountains, you know. But it's not easy, definitely.
Yeah.
You know, we still live in this fleshly nature and this fleshly state. So it's a battle against the flesh every single day.
Thank you so much for sharing it. I hope that the people who listen to this would really be moved just to start preaching the gospel in their own areas, in the places where they are. We don't need to have our country torn by war for us to do the call and the mission of Christ. We are called at where we are. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 talks about that. And I would encourage all of the listeners, if you want to find out more, Mike will be giving us pictures and videos that we're going to provide, and you're going to be able to see on the website. Check out timeforthesoul.co. Go to the show episode, and you'll be able to see more about what he talked about over there. I also want to announce that we're going to be fundraising for the Great Commission Society, that organization that Mike worked with. And if you guys want to contribute to this need, there is still a lot of need out there, a lot of supplies and things that Ukraine will need. And they're actually there right now, from what I understand, as we're recording. So if you guys want to buy a Love God, Love People crewneck sweatshirt, we're going to be selling some baseball caps on the Love God Tea website. I'll link that in the show notes. All profits will be matched by a corporate sponsor and will go directly to this organization and to this ministry. If you want to just donate directly, feel free to do that as well. We're going to provide the links in the show notes. And whatever you might feel on your heart, you know, feel free to do that. Mike, how can we find you if someone wants to reach out?
So obviously, I'm on Instagram. My handle is Mike Gnaty, so Gnaty. You can find me on there. You know, you can text me as well if the people have my phone number, but you can get a hold of me one way or another, either through you guys' podcast or through Instagram. So
that's awesome. Thanks so much, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
And we appreciate you. God bless. We'll see ya. Bye-bye.
See ya. Bye.